Welcome to Beyond the Hype, exposing the fiction in human performance. This is where we dig into the science behind the claims and separate evidence from anecdote. Beyond the Hype is a podcast where science speaks louder than trends. I'm Professor Frank Marino from Charles Sturt University, researcher, educator and explorer of human physiology under extreme conditions. I spent my career studying how the human body performs, adapts and deals with pressure. I hold a PhD and a Doctor of Science. I've published over 130 peer-reviewed papers and authored the book Human Fatigue, Evolution, Health and Performance. And my work has been cited over 9,000 times in the scientific literature. I'm speaking to you from Wiradjuri land in the picturesque tablelands of New South Wales, and I'll be your guide as we challenge assumptions, test the trends and uncover what's real when it comes to human performance. Each episode we dive into the science behind performance. Fatigue, my favourite topic, thermoregulation, cold baths, compression garments, recovery and more, separating fact from fiction and research from rhetoric. If you're tired of fitness fads, miracle claims and clickbait science, this is your space. We're here to dig deeper into data, into mechanisms and into what really drives and extends the human limits. Whether you're an athlete, a student, a fellow researcher, or just performance curious, you're in the right place. Get ready to think critically and have a little bit of fun doing it. So let's strip away the buzzwords and get into the basics of evidence. Welcome to Beyond the Hype. Before we dive into the physiology, the performance metrics, the heat stress, the fatigue curves, I want to start this series with a different kind of conversation. We need to talk about how science actually works, and just importantly, what happens when it's ignored. Because I don't want this podcast to just be about what the science says. I want to help you understand how science thinks, and how we, as both scientists and consumers of information, can tell the difference between hype and evidence. If you've paid close attention over the past few years, we've witnessed what I believe to be a worrying rise in anti-science thinking and an attack on expertise. You only have to go to any social media platform, spend a few minutes, and you will be able to read the most incredible claims based on something that someone heard. The worst of it is that there is so much certainty attached to that particular claim. In fact, while I was recording this podcast, I decided to test that little theory. So I went to a social media platform, and within 30 seconds, I found exactly what I was looking for. And here it is. I quote, "In less than 48 hours, I've reported on the sudden deaths of 22 and 33-year-old star athletes dying suddenly, and now a fit 44-year-old soccer star dying suddenly. Cardiac arrest. Do you know what all three had in common? Please say yes if you can see this, as we are censored." Clearly, this is a tragedy, a sad occurrence. Now, at first glance, this statement is powerful. It's short, confident, and it implies urgency. But here's the problem. It's also incredibly misleading. Sudden death in young people is rare, but it's not new. It's been documented for centuries, long before social media, long before modern medicine, and certainly long before whatever the author of that post is implying has actually changed. In ancient Greece, there are accounts of young athletes collapsing during the Olympic Games. Medical literature from the 19th and early 20th centuries describes cases that, in hindsight, were almost certainly hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, congenital coronary anomalies, or fatal heart rhythm disorders. These conditions have always been with us. So, what's changed? Let's just briefly look at the possibilities. First, today, if a young athlete collapses, it can be recorded, shared, and viewed millions of times within minutes or hours. In the past, these events rarely left the local community. Second, advances in cardiology and pathology mean that we can now identify the causes with far greater precision. Cases that once went down as mysterious are now recognised as structural or electrical heart problems. Third, and something a little bit more nuanced, is that we also need to consider the global population. For example, in 1850, the global population was about 1.26 billion people, and by 1940, it was 2.3 billion. And by the end of 2024, it's a staggering 8.2 billion, is a 6.5-fold increase in the total population. Why is this important to think about? Well, consider this. If the proportion of young people, let's say between the ages of 15 and 35, stayed constant, the number of young people globally has increased by roughly the same factor. So, if the proportion or the rate of people affected stays constant, the raw number of events rises with the population. For example, if sudden cardiac death in young adults occurs at, say, 1 per 100,000 per year, so if we did the calculation, in 1850, with about 400 million young people, that would mean it'd be about 4,000 events per year. In 2024, with 2.6 billion young people, that would be about 26,000 events per year. This is without any change in risk, just more people. So, what's the bottom line? Even if the risk per person hasn't changed, the massive increase in what we might say the number of global young people since 1850 means more total cases of sudden death in young people. So headlines talking about more cases than ever often ignore this, which can be a pure number effect, not a sign the condition is more common. So when you hear the statement like, "This is new," or "What have they all got in common?" the key question to ask is this: is it actually new, or are we just seeing it more clearly? In this case, the science is clear. Sudden death in young people is a tragic, long-standing phenomenon, and while science is working to understand and prevent it, we should be careful not to rewrite history just because the story has become more visible. The anti-science and attack on expertise sometimes is loud, conspiracy-driven, anti-vaccine, climate-denying, and so on. But more often, it's subtle. It shows up in simplified headlines, in the promise of quick fixes, or with influencers offering certainty in spaces where the truth is anything but so simple. I get it. Science can feel messy, especially if it's not your thing. Science evolves, and yes, it contradicts itself. We live in a new age and world that rewards fast answers and bold opinions. But science is slow. It's self-critical and full of uncertainty and takes its time to correct itself. Even for the most hardcore scientists, it can feel out of step. But here's the key idea I want to explore today in this episode. Science isn't supposed to give us certainty. In fact, it has never promised to do that. Even when the scientific method was born, it never claimed to provide certainty about anything. What it does claim, though, is it's supposed to give us clarity about what we don't yet know. So, what is science? Well, science is not a collection of facts. It's a method, a way of asking questions and testing ideas against reality. When I think about this, I can't get past the way in which the great Richard Feynman put it. And this is what he said, and I quote, "In general, we look for a new law by the following process. First we guess it, then we compute the consequences of the guess to see if this law is right, what it would imply. Then we compare the computation to nature or experimentation or experience. Compare it directly to observation to see if it works. If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. In that simple statement is the key to science. It doesn't make a difference how beautiful your guess is, doesn't matter how smart you are, who made the guess, or what his name is. If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong." End of quote. The point is, we observe, we hypothesize, we test, we measure, we revise, and then we do it all over again. It's not about proving yourself right. In fact, most good scientists spend more time trying to disprove their assumptions than confirm them. This is the key element of science because we hear it all the time. Statements like, "Science proved it." Actually, that's exactly what it doesn't do. Scientists have the burden of disproof. That is, the real burden isn't to prove something is true. It's to try your hardest to show that it might be false. A good hypothesis should be testable in a way that could prove it to be wrong. That means that if it survives repeated attempts at disproof, we can start to trust it. Not because it's been proven forever, but because it's withstood everything we've thrown at it so far. That's how science gets stronger, not by stacking up supportive claims, but by surviving rigorous challenge. For example, Darwin's theory of natural selection and Einstein's theory of relativity are the two most widely known theories. You don't really need to understand them, but what you do need to know is that these two theories have actually escaped refutation. And every time a scientist attempts to refute the theory and they fail, the theory gets stronger and it moves closer to what we think is the truth. In fact, Einstein said it best himself when he said that no amount of experimentation can ever prove me right, a single experiment can prove me wrong. And when a study is published, that's not the final word, it's the beginning of a conversation. Other scientists challenge it, replicate it, build on it. That's how knowledge progresses. Now, I've published over 130 peer-reviewed papers. None of them were perfect. Some were revised heavily before publication, some had unexpected results, others were improved because a reviewer challenged a weak point in the methodology or the rationale for the study. That's a good thing. That process, as frustrating as it is what makes science work. The goal isn't to be right on the first go, it's to get closer to the truth over time. And so when I hear politicians and journalists and keyboard warriors state things like, that study was peer-reviewed, as if it is now the truth forevermore, it really means that they have not understood the peer review process. We can leave this point for another time, but what you should know is that by the time a study or an experiment is published, its hypothesis, the theory, the results, the conclusions are fairly old. From the moment someone conceives of a study, to acquiring the funding, to collecting the data, analysing it, and then interpreting, and then submitting it for peer review and going through that whole process, the study could be many years old. This is part of the complicated truth. But history shows us something else. When people want certainty and a quick solution, they will often choose the confident lie over the complicated truth. That brings me to snake oil, which is the title for this particular episode. So, in the 19th century, snake oil was marketed as a miracle cure. It promised to fix everything from joint pain to baldness to fatigue. The original Chinese remedy did contain oil from the Chinese water snake, which has omega-3 fatty acids and can help reduce inflammation. But when the product made its way to the United States, most so-called snake oil contained no snake oil at all, just mineral oil, alcohol, and a mix of herbs. The real selling point wasn't the content, it was the story. Travelling salesmen known as snake oil peddlers would roll into town with showmanship, testimonials, and guaranteed results. There was no peer review, no double-blind trials, just a promise that sounded too good to be true and therefore too good to ignore, especially if it claimed to cure the very ailment you were suffering from. But here's the kicker. It worked. At least it sold, because people wanted to believe. Fast forward to today and the snake oil is still here. It's just been rebranded. It's a supplement promising to supercharge your recovery. It's a gadget claiming to optimise your performance with no effort. It's the influencer who apparently knows the secret the experts who study this for a meagre living don't want you to hear about. I don't know any experts that actually want to keep the discovery they've made to themselves. The formula hasn't changed. Hype always eclipses evidence, and those who shout the loudest often drown out those of us who measure things in the most careful way. So that's an example from the 19th century. But let me give you an example that's a little more contemporary. Everyone who has an interest in human performance will no doubt have heard the term lactic acid. And even if you don't know what it is, I'm fairly certain that the majority of people have been told or have heard that it's the cause of fatigue. My recollection as an undergraduate studying human performance was that lactic acid was part of a complex metabolic system and that it was just one potential culprit for fatigue. There was never any certainty about this, but yet the myth that lactic acid causes fatigue continues to this very day. In fact, as a father of a child who enjoyed and played football at a reasonable level, I was dragged along to a sports store to purchase a set of compression garments, which according to the 18-year-old store attendant behind the counter, was adamant that wearing the compression garments would reduce the amount of lactic acid and would improve my son's performance immeasurably. Of course, I'm complicit in circulating the myth because as a parent, I didn't want to argue with the 18-year-old, and I certainly didn't want to disappoint my son by walking out of the store without the compression garments based on sound theory rather than hype. If you like that one, here's another quick one. Oxygenated water. This hit the shelves with sleek bottles and bold claims. More oxygen in the water meant more oxygen in your blood, more energy, faster recovery, and better performance. Some brands even suggested it could help you think clearer, detox your body, and boost your endurance. It sounded scientific. After all, oxygen is vital for life, and elite athletes are always looking for an edge. The bottles often had lab-like branding, diagrams of molecules, and just enough jargon to feel convincing. There's just one small problem. It's called human physiology. When you drink water, it doesn't go straight into your lungs or into your bloodstream as gas. Oxygen in water is in such tiny amounts, even in super oxygenated bottles, whatever that is trivial compared to what you get from a single breath. Your gut isn't designed to absorb oxygen from liquid into your blood in any meaningful way. Controlled studies confirmed it. No measurable boost in blood oxygen, no performance enhancement beyond what plain water and proper hydration already provided. But here's the thing. It didn't matter to the marketing. For a while, bottles of oxygenated water sold for many times the price of regular water. It was clean, trendy, and promised the benefit that people wanted to believe in. And like all good hype, it wasn't entirely false. Oxygen is important for performance. It is. The trick was in the leap from that basic truth to a product that couldn't actually deliver in the way that it implied. Oxygenated water faded when the buzz wore off, but it's never really gone. The same idea keeps coming back in different forms. Hyperoxygenated sports drinks, oxygen capsules, even oxygen shots at some spas. Different bottle, same promise. Just another reminder, in performance and in health, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably belongs in the history of hype. This is where science struggles to compete, and as a scientist, we need to do better at communicating. Science doesn't sell certainty, it sells probability. It says, here's what the data suggests, and here's the margin of error. That is nowhere near as flashy as guaranteed results in 7 days. But that's exactly why we need to protect scientific thinking, because without it, we're left with nothing but marketing and hype. And this is why I care so deeply about bringing this conversation into performance science. In sport, fitness and health, science is often reduced to sound bites because that's what sells. We hear things like, this supplement boosts your VO2 max by 12%, as if everybody knows what a VO2 max is. This protocol hacks your recovery in half. This wearable optimizes your training instantly. Sometimes there's a kernel of truth. More often, there's a marketing team behind the message. Anecdotes are not evidence. One study isn't a breakthrough. And hype doesn't change biology. That's a fact. The human body doesn't respond to slogans, it responds to stimulus, stress, recovery, and time. That's why I created this podcast, because the people I work with, my colleagues, athletes, coaches, students, they're smart. They want to understand what's real, but the noise out there makes it hard to find clarity. So, this show will be about unpacking the mechanisms, looking at what we know, what we don't know, and what's emerging. And importantly, helping you think like a scientist, even if you're not one, or at least understand how a scientist goes about their work. In future episodes, we'll dig into why we get tired and why it's not just lactic acid, how heat affects performance and decision making, what recovery really looks like at the cellular level, and how to interpret studies without getting lost in the jargon. But first, I hope this episode has given you a sense of what I value. Not hype, not certainty, but clarity, through the lens of evidence. Thanks for joining me for this first conversation. If you found it helpful, feel free to share it. And if there's a topic you'd like me to break down in a future episode, let me know in the comments. Next time on Beyond the Hype, we'll take the plunge into the world of modern cold water immersion and go back to where it began, with the science of pre-cooling and the first experiments on lowering body temperature to boost performance in the heat. I'm Professor Frank Marino, and this is Beyond the Hype.